Welcome to the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show. Presented by the Michigan Nursery and Landscape Association. Now here's your Garden Show host, Dr. Bob Schutzke.
Hello everyone. Welcome to the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show, brought to you by the Michigan Nursery and Landscape Association. I am Dr. Bob, your host for the 2021 gardening season. Tune in every Saturday at 4 p.m. through August. We will share garden insights, feature guests from Michigan's green industry, and answer your questions submitted through PlantMichiganGreen.com Ask the Expert. Our hope is to make the most of your outdoor living experience. During the week, you can log on to PlantMichiganGreen.com, your landscaping and horticulture resource, to pose gardening questions, find a professional horticulturist, locate a retail garden center in your area, or become aware of the rewarding careers in Michigan's green industry. We will spend today's show with two professional horticulturists and members of the Michigan Nursery and Landscape Association. Dan Riddle, the 2021 MNLA President and owner of Trees of Field and Parma Tree Farm, and Adam DeLamielleure, MNLA Director at Large and Director of Support for Clogg Landscape Associates. They will be with us after a short break, so stick around and get into the gardening groove on the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show on News Talk 760 WJR. Welcome back. We are pleased to have Dan Riddle, 2021 MNLA President and owner of Trees of Field and Parma Tree Farm. Dan will give us a behind-the-scenes look at plants and tell us a little bit about the supply chain in the green industry. Hi, Dan. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing well. How about you?
Great. Thanks for joining us on the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show. So tell us what it takes to get a plant to the marketplace.
It's my pleasure to join you. There's a whole number of things that happen to get a plant to the marketplace. It involves everything from propagation, which is sowing the seed or making the cutting, growing that plant into a liner, which is a small starter plant, getting that plant to the grower. The grower grows it for a period of anywhere from 3 to 5 years in trees, and sometimes beyond that. Then from that point, it ends up going to either a re-wholesaler or garden center or landscaper. So there's quite a few areas where things can go wrong or things can go right. But what happens when supplies get tight, we can't just knee-jerk reaction. People will sometimes, when we're out of something, say, well, can't you just get more? They're not widgets. We can't just make more.
Actually, you bring up a good point, Dan, and that in many respects, when we think about how a plant is identified to join the marketplace, it's kind of interesting. And so that nursery may choose a cultivar or may choose a species, and when propagation starts, it's like you said, anywhere from 3 to 7 years before a plant can get to the point where it's saleable to either garden centers or landscape contractors. So there's quite a bit of time that is spent in getting it to the point where it can be used in somebody's landscape.
Exactly, and the part we didn't even touch on was, you touched on a little, was new varieties. I was at a facility out in the Northwest that was doing rose breeding, and it's like 3 to 5 years to even get a new variety of pollinating from one bud to another bud and that sort of thing, which just, it was phenomenal to see the patience that people in our industry have in just developing things and growing things and watching and just working alongside with what we're dealt with weather-wise and everything else.
Yeah, we've experienced that when Emerald ash borer came into the into the scene. Because when people said, well, why can't we just find other trees than the ash? And nurseries weren't growing the number of other tree species that we needed to supply the vacancy that was supplied by the loss of green and white ash.
Exactly. We actually purchased the farm out in Parma, Michigan, right about the time that the ash borer went into play, and trees were in short supply just because of all the building back in that time, like 20 some years ago. So you put on top of that one of our major players coming out of the supply chain, and all of a sudden the supply was just crazy, and we normally would just sell trees at 2-inch caliper. That's kind of the norm. What we saw was the size that people were willing to accept started shrinking to smaller, which took care of the immediate problem of trying to sell trees, but it created a problem down the road with the availability of larger trees down there. We had, I want to say, 2,000 ash in the field that there was absolutely nothing wrong with them other than they couldn't be sold. So they all got pulled out, and we had to make room for more trees. But what municipalities are doing, which is really smart, is they're doing tree inventories, and they're saying we don't want to plant more than 10% of any one tree. So we try and do that as well in the supply side, where we try and have a very broad, diverse, so that if we have a problem with one particular tree, we don't lose a huge percentage of our crop. So it's a balancing, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. So given where we are today in 2021, are there any plant trends or tree trends that consumers should be aware of?
You know, I think the best one, which has always been a thing, is the right plant for the right place. So when you go to plant a tree, everybody loves to plant trees. Everybody feels good about planting trees. They give us oxygen. They soak up rainwater. But you need to look around, and you need to look above, and you need to look at that tree and say, where does that tree really want to grow? If it's an understory tree, it wants to grow protected by other things. If there's wires overhead, you don't want to plant a tree that's going to get 50 or 60 feet tall. It's not going to be good for anyone. And so that's probably the number one trend that people are really paying more attention to, is they're looking at the surroundings, they're looking at the site, and they're consulting with experts. I've always said it's when you ask a question, don't feel like that's a sign of wisdom, not ignorance. Well, it's actually both. It takes wisdom to admit that you're ignorant about a subject, but it also takes wisdom to ask for help and just say, am I doing the right thing here? And so that's key.
There's a lot of truth in that saying, right plant, right place, and it's not only for how large the tree is going to grow or its spread, but also its soil type preferences. And so when we think about right tree, right place, in selecting any plant material, whether it's perennials, shrubs, or even trees, it's important to look at the conditions and match the plant to the site rather than try to match the site to the plant.
Exactly. Anytime you try and argue with nature, with God, you're going to lose. So if you can look at the site and determine what's going to work well there, you're definitely ahead of the game. That said, it's a lot easier to experiment with some smaller plants that if they don't do well, you can move them. That becomes a bit of a problem with trees.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, hold those thoughts, Dan. We need to take a short break. And so stay tuned for more from Dan Riddle and the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show on News Talk 760 WJR.
Welcome back to more of the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show with your host, Dr. Bob Schutsky.
Welcome back. We're here with Dan Riddle 2021 MNLA president and owner of Trees of Field and the Parma Tree Farm. And we've been talking about plants and the green industry. So Dan, tell us what it is to be a member of the green industry business.
Well, Bob, in a word, it's living the dream. It's
great.
We're surrounded by nature. We're helping kind of put things back to the way they should be. When someone builds a house, quite often everything that was there has been wiped out, and our job is to make that house feel like a home. And so it's just a joy because it's a combination of art, restoration, and just there's days when it feels like the Garden of Eden, and there's days when it feels like a little shop of horrors sometimes.
Yeah.
But the Garden of Eden days are far, far ahead of that. I was thinking on my drive in this morning, I was looking around, and I can name almost every single tree that I see on the side of the road. And I think that's so cool when something like right now, the elderberry are in full flower. And I can look at that and go, wow, isn't that cool? It drives the person in the car nuts sometimes, but...
Yeah, I can understand. It's the same thing when I drive around and say, look at this or look at that, and I've seen that before. Well, for us, every time we look at a plant, we see a little bit more or see something a little bit different.
Yeah, and coworkers either love it or hate it. The ones that love it are the ones that are hooked. And, I had a guy working with me that knew nothing about trees, and by the end of things, he was showing me things. And so it's really cool to see when you can really spark someone's passion. But, I mean, to be surrounded by nature like that, I'm not a real fan of cold weather, so... in my part of the industry, we can't do much in the wintertime, and so for me it's a bonus just to be able to leave and enjoy some time off in the wintertime.
Yeah.
We work a lot of hours in the spring and fall and summertime, but we comp it.
Hey, do you have any fun stories or interesting stories about people coming in and purchasing plants from you?
One of my favorite things, the catalpas, which are a big gnarly tree, just finished flowering about a week ago. And to me, the catalpa is just such a paradox of nature because it's this big gnarly tree that in the wintertime has very few branches and just looks so rugged. But when it flowers and those flowers hit the ground, you can pick up one of those flowers and take it to someone and ask them what it is. And most people have no clue. But when you look at it, it looks like almost like an orchid. And it's coming off this big, gnarly, ugly, rugged tree. So to me, it's such a cool thing to look at just the different way things are created and the different paradoxes. And you can't, I mean, it's a lot about not judging whether it's a tree or a person by their outward appearance, because there's really cool moments like that in nature.
Right. Do you have any other favorite plants that come to mind?
Well, I used to always joke and say it's the tree that just left on the truck, but seriously, probably two of my favorite trees would be the tricolor beech, which is just such a beautiful tree and kind of knows its boundaries. You can plant it in a spot, and I've known people that have bought houses because it had a tricolor beech in it, and they're just such a beautiful tree. You can't put a specimen tree like that in a house that doesn't have one. But my other favorite would be the redbud, American redbud, because it's one of the first things to flower in the spring.
I agree with you on the tricolor beech. It seems like when the sun hits the leaves in a certain way, they almost glow with the different colors. Really attractive.
Yeah, especially like late May, early June. I was out at the farm, and just it's exactly like you say. The sun was just at the right angle, and it looked electric looking down that row. It was just phenomenal.
Yeah, I also like redbud because I think it's a plant for all seasons. In fact, each season you can get an interesting characteristic or ornamental quality from the eastern redbuds.
Exactly. And one of the keys with redbud is parentage, and we really, really work hard to make sure that we get Michigan seed source when we grow our redbud, because they just are really attuned to growing where they want, where they were born. You pull something from out of state, and sometimes they do okay, sometimes they don't.
Redbud is native along the southern part of the lower peninsula. In fact, I've walked through the woods along the Kalamazoo River and come upon beautiful stands of redbud. So being able to have a northern sourced plant, and there's a lot to be said between northern sourced and southern sourced when it comes to plants having the appropriate cold hardiness that we need for a plant to survive our winters.
Exactly, and there's been a lot of talk about climate change and that sort of thing, and people would come in with lists of trees that they think will survive climate change, and that's definitely one of those experimental things when you start bringing things up from southern Ohio, Kentucky native ranges, and you start bringing them into Michigan. You're really rolling the dice. But at some
Right.
point we have to experiment, and that's one of the really cool things about being a first generation nurseryman is I'm not afraid to try new things, and I've learned sometimes from mistakes. I've learned good things and I've learned bad things. Won't do that again, but I've learned sometimes you can dig things at times when other people say you can't.
Yeah. Actually, that's a good point in terms of most nurseries do that experimentation. So they'll bring in a particular plant, grow them for a while, see if there's any major impact by climate or weather. And especially this past year, we've experienced those late spring frosts. And those late spring frosts can do a number on trees or shrubs that leaf out early. And the southern sourced plants quite often leaf out earlier than our more cold hardy plants that we have in the northern climates.
Right, and that gets back to the full circle on supply chain, and I mean part of the issue with supply chain in Michigan is, I mean, we do have growers that are retiring. We do have younger generation that may or may not be picking up the ball and running with it. So we do have to source things from different places from time to time. And again, you tie that with that production cycle where I always say the best thing that I could have would be a crystal ball to know what's going to sell 5 years from now. It'll probably be on my tombstone, but I always say growing a tree is relatively easy. Knowing what to plant is the hardest part.
Yeah, that's true because if it takes 5 years to bring a plant to market, who knows if the conditions are going to be set, or even if the interest in that particular plant will be there in those subsequent years.
Or if a pest is going to attack it, or there's so many variables. If you look at it, you just say who would it's nuts. But you look at the other side of working in the Garden of Eden, and it's nuts not to work in this industry.
Yeah, that's a good point about the pests. Last week we had Deb McCullough from MSU on the show, and she presented a whole lot of scenarios with some of the major pests that we're finding on our tree species. So tell me, Dan, what is it like being a member of the Michigan Nursery and Landscape Association?
I tell you, I've been a member for well over 30 years, and I've made so many friends throughout the industry, and I've learned so much from other members, and I've taught other members too. But in teaching, you also learn. It's a great sounding board. If you're having an issue, our industry is very unique, where you can call another member and say, "Hey, I'm having a problem with this. What worked for you?" And there's not a lot of gee, I don't want to give away my trade secrets. We're all pretty open. We all try to help each other through good and bad. There's also accountability. I mean, we see somebody that's maybe on the edge, we kind of pull them along and say, come on, we're better than this together. So it's just a great group of people, a great group of friends. And then our staff, whenever we have an issue, we can count on our staff to help us through. And our staff is always looking ahead, just like we have to look ahead with what trees and what shrubs to be planting years down the road. They're looking ahead and they're saying, what are some issues that we need to address? So they're trying to address those before they become problems with us. So it's been the joy of my life to be a part of this industry and this association in particular.
One of the things I like to add about the association too is when they're addressing problems or concerns of the industry, the ultimate beneficiary of that concern is the consumer, because anything that helps you be better business people is also helping to be better contractors or service providers to the consumer.
Right, and it also, with the education that we have in the wintertime, we're able to stay up to date with the best practices, regulations. We're able to really have a pipeline into what we should be doing, where when you're not part of an association like this, you miss out on a lot of that. You're reading the same thing as the rest of the public, and you may find out later after it's too late to find out, gee, we shouldn't have pruned oak this time of year.
Right.
Something.
Well, anyway, we need to take a short break now, but thanks very much for joining us today and sharing your information. And if you have any questions for Dan, visit plantmichigangreen.com and submit your questions to Ask the Expert, and we'll get Dan to respond to them. We may mention some of those in the air. So stick around, because up next is Adam DeLamielleure, the M&LA Director at Large and Director of Support for Troy Clogg Landscape Associates. He will share some information about landscape trends and career in the green industry on the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show right here on 760 WJR. Welcome back. We're here with Adam DeLamielleure, M&LA Director at Large and Director of Support for Troy Clogg Landscape Associates. Adam is going to tell us about landscape trends and career in the green industry. Hi, Adam. How are you?
I'm doing good, sir. How you doing?
Doing great. Hey, thanks for being with us today. So why don't you share some landscape trends that you experience out there in the industry?
Well, so kind of a few things is, right now everything's so busy. Last year, when everybody was at home, they were doing a lot of do-it-yourself things. But now we're kind of seeing the same thing. They're still spending the money outside. They're still doing the projects outside, and everybody's busy. And the contractors are, looking for help. So everybody's backed up. Everybody's booked up. Homeowners really need to be patient and be flexible. The other thing I would say is, just from a trend standpoint, the outdoor living is still just a huge trend, maybe even more so now. People spent a lot of time at home last year, and they're like, this is what I want. Swimming pools are really common. Yeah.
So give me your definition of an outdoor living space.
Well, the definition is going to be different for every family. Some families are going to want to be able to cook out there, entertain out there. It could be as simple as a patio with a table and chairs, or a full-blown kitchen with a fireplace, fire pit, or whatever, or even the pool. So how somebody's living outside is going to define what that is. For us, we tend, on our construction side of things, we tend to work on some pretty big projects that have all the bells and whistles. But it's not every job, and it's not every homeowner.
And so one of the things that I've noticed over the years is there tends to be a lot of glamour and excitement about the big spaces, but what about small garden spaces? Can you give us a little bit of an idea on what is a small garden space and how, and many of our listeners would probably be in a position to have smaller spaces than some of these big projects that many people talk about.
Absolutely. Not every job is going to have all of it. So the small spaces, you know, they got to be what's special to the person. It could be anything from a container garden where they're growing just a few herbs or something. The whole idea is to make it your own and to find those plants or those materials that you like, and that are going to work for you. I at my house this year, I got a 4-year-old and planted a vegetable garden, and that's our space. And I'm trying to kind of get her to love it too. And it doesn't look like much, but it's special to me, and someday hopefully to her. So.
Actually, that's a good point in making it your own. And so it doesn't matter whether you have an outdoor kitchen or whether you're using a barbecue grill. It doesn't matter whether you have 5 acres or you have a 1/4 acre lot. Whatever you can do to develop that outdoor living space for your family and friends is the key.
Yep. And to the whole barbecue thing, a lot of people will go and they'll buy a new home and they'll build this space, but after they live in it a little bit, they find out that it doesn't work for them. So when we moved into our house, the barbecue went on the back porch or the back deck. Well, it didn't work all year long. Now my barbecue's in the garage, and I go out there and I cook, and I'm okay with that. And so as a lot of times people want to just get that instant, like, here you go, this is what it is. But sometimes you want to live in the space a little bit to see how you're going to use it, see where you're going to hang out, see how you end up living in it.
Actually, that's a good point, because a lot of times we often talked about when a person's developing their landscape, if you've lived in a place for 12 months, you've experienced spring, summer, fall, and winter. That may help you shape the type of outdoor space that's really going to fit your lifestyle, your family needs, and that. So that's a really great point. As a designer, I'm sure that you've helped walk people through what's the potential if they've experienced a specific season or not, and what it would be like to experience that season.
Yeah. So like at our house, when we bought the house, we have like a covered porch on the back, and there were blinds that came with the porch that would hang there to keep the sun off the deck late in the day. Well, there's also a tree that was planted there, and that tree now serves as those blinds. We don't have to put the blinds up. So you have to keep in mind that you plan a landscape to grow and to change and to be more beautiful in 10 years than it is today. And you got to keep those things in mind and learn what your place is and how you're going to use it.
Hey, I know of your experiences with hardscapes. Can you share a little bit about hardscapes for our listeners and what you as a professional think about when you're either developing your own or even giving some ideas to your friends and family about developing their hardscapes?
You got to figure out what's going to work for you, because sometimes too much hardscape can just make a place seem like a fortress or just too hard. So you really have to balance that with the plant material and the softer aspects of the landscape. Just because you can build walls and columns and fireplaces doesn't mean you should. It's not necessarily good landscape design. So really understand what it's going to look like over time. I believe that you should really plan out where you're going to live and how much space you need, because it's easier to do it right off the get-go. Like in terms of a size standpoint, then you get into like product selection. You can get really overwhelmed by all the different products out there, simplify it. Get a catalog, look through it fast, figure out if you're going back to the same product over and over again, there's a good likelihood that you like a certain product. Those are just a couple quick tips that I always think.
If you go on the plantmichigangreen.com website, you get the inspiration gallery, which has really nice ideas as well. But big isn't always better when it comes to developing these spaces. And you also bring up a good point about balancing, I'll call the green space with plants and the hardscape. Can you talk about some plants that you have worked with over the years and find helpful in providing that ornamental appeal to somebody's yard?
Like like my horticultural prowess isn't what it used to be. So I found that there's certain things I like. Now I'm gonna choose to answer your question maybe with I'm not gonna answer your question. As a landscape designer, when you first start, you plan for the big wow, this thing that flowers, the big, like one thing you talked a few weeks ago about plants for all seasons. As a landscape designer becomes more sophisticated, becomes more complete in kind of their trade, they start to develop things for the plants for all seasons, things that are going to look good year round. Ultimately, I believe people start to use texture. I think texture is like the missing link in in landscape, and then in hardscape. So and kind of what I've seen and what I like is I like to develop texture into the hardscape, and then complement that texture in the hardscape with plants. So grasses, like some of the dwarf ornamental grasses, are great additions. They add that kind of fluffiness to something that's really hard. Hedges tend to be really good and kind of to reinforce the lines of hardscape. I like plants like lavender, and then like I said, I'm not as good as I used to be. You're probably disappointed in me, but
And the reason Adam says that, because Adam was a student of mine back at MSU. Adam, thanks for that information. It was really helpful, and hopefully our listeners can pick up on some of the important points that you shared with them about trends in the landscape and developing their outdoor living spaces. So we're going to take a short break right now. So stay tuned for more on PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show right here on 760 WJR.
Now back to more gardening with your host, Dr. Bob Schutzke, on the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show. Here's Dr. Bob.
And I'm just going to end this week's show with a question from Lana. She talks about listening to the 760 program this afternoon, and she has a tree that has branches that hang like an umbrella, and she attached 2 photos of that tree and then proceeded to ask me about problems that she was having on that tree. And I have to say that Lana's picture made it so easy to not only diagnose and identify the tree, but also diagnose the problem. So thanks a lot, Lana. The question she had, first of all, the tree that she has is a Camperdown elm. Camperdown elm is a weeping tree. It's grafted on a standard, which means it's usually grafted about 4 to 5 feet off the ground. And it's what I would call an old world plant. There was a lot of them planted a long time ago. You still find some of them around today, but especially college campuses and parks, in cemeteries. You could also find some very old, very characteristic and picturesque Camperdown elm. The problems that she had were, one, with growths on the leaves. They simply looked like warts. And she was wondering about those. And then she had some brown patches on the leaves as well. Let's start with the growths. The growths are from an aphid. And there's several different aphids and actually parasitic wasps that will sting the leaf. And in stinging the leaf, it causes the cells on the leaves to mutate. And those mutated cells actually create this wart that we see. Not only that, many times the aphids or the wasps that sting the leaf lay their eggs right before the wart is formed. The wart or the gall is actually an encasement for the eggs, and eventually the eggs emerge, and the adult may fly out from it. In most cases, these warts or galls that form on the leaves will not cause any permanent damage. They're somewhat unsightly, but it's not going to be detrimental to the tree itself. The next were brown patches on the leaves of the elms as well. And this is an elm leaf spot disease. And again, these are unsightly. They cause damage to the existing leaves, but they do not cause long-term damage to the tree. There's really no specified treatment for these leaf spots. By the time the spots are visible, it's usually too late to have any benefit from a treatment. The standard recommendations are to clean up the fallen leaves, remove them to the site, usually placing them in the trash. And removing the leaves from the site helps to minimize the inoculum for next year. So again, there's many leaf spots that again won't cause detrimental effect and shouldn't be any of real concern. However, there are other leaf spots that are a problem and that do cause concerns. For example, if you have some of the leaf spots on crab apples or apples, these particular leaf spots will actually weaken the tree by causing issues with photosynthesis and the ability of the plant to store fruit, or to store carbohydrates. But again, one of the things that's important, if you do have some leaf spots or any leaf disorders, take a picture, send them to plantmichigangreen.com, ask the expert, and we'll try to identify those for you, or take them to your local garden center, and they will be able to identify them and give you some prescribed treatments. And so that's it for today's show. So don't forget to visit our website, plantmichigangreen.com, and click on Ask the Expert to submit your landscape and gardening questions. Remember to tune in every Saturday at 4 p.m. through August for the best information and advice to maximize your outdoor living experience. And during the week, log on to plantmichigangreen.com, your landscaping horticulture resource, to find a professional, a retail garden center, pose your gardening questions, or explore rewarding careers in the green industry. That's all for this week. I'm Dr. Bob, wishing you sunshine, a little rain, and hopefully we'll talk again next week.
You've been listening to the PlantMichiganGreen.com Gardening Show with Dr. Bob Schutzke, presented by the Michigan Nursery and Landscape Association.